Hospitals are overwhelmed. The elderly, the immunocompromised, and even some of the otherwise healthy are dying in droves. People have become shut-ins, seemingly overnight. It seems certain that there will be considerable suffering physically, psychologically, and financially in the month ahead. The media often use the phrase paradigm shift to describe historical turning points that change the course of history. September 11th, 2001, World War II, and the Great Depression were all such pivotal moments. Besides the obvious toll on healthcare systems, what is even more alarming is the cessation of people's activities outside of homes. When shelter in place persists weeks and months on end, no one knows what the final endgame will be. Inadvertently, 4 billion people around the world have become unwilling participants in an otherwise unfathomable experiment. The question at hand becomes, what if economic activities stopped altogether? No one knows for sure what the answer to that question will be, but without a doubt, the repercussions of the crisis are shaping up to be a true paradigm shift. The last time the world experienced this kind of shock to the economy was during the Great Depression in the 1930s. Because of that, the current crisis is something that most of us have not witnessed or lived through. So far, millions have lost their sources of income. The industries impacted are not just hospitality, food and beverages, travel, and entertainment. Global supply chains have been impacted greatly. Products across all industries, whether consumer or industrial, are delayed and paused in their manufacturing, shipping, and delivery. This is leading to trillions of dollars in losses. Companies, their suppliers, and their suppliers' suppliers will all feel the pinch. The demand for overall goods and services is dropping drastically. These effects are in turn leading to further reductions in revenues, leading to more layoffs and bankruptcies, driving up unemployment. Through this downward spiral, we find ourselves in a global recession, a depression, or even possibly an economic ice age. Given these hardships ahead, this question emerges: what will the world look like after the coronavirus pandemic? Perhaps a review of the Great Depression, a similar economic ice age that lasted from the 1920s to the 1930s, will give us some insights. Photos of unemployed people lining up for government benefits remind us of the 1931 photo of men lining up at soup kitchens, when the unemployment rate rose to as high as 25% in the United States. Although the cause of the Great Depression was not a pandemic, the resulting economic downward spiral and mass unemployment were similar. What exacerbated the situation back then were the introductions of new import tariffs aimed at protecting American businesses. Tariffs were raised to their highest level ever in the United States, with the average tariff rate on dutiable imports going from 40.1% in 1929 to 59.1% in 1931. Once the tariffs were introduced, other nations set retaliatory tariffs on US goods. As a result of this, global trade was decimated. The compounding effect of this further drove up unemployment. Shantytowns known as Hoovervilles showed up across America. Named after President Herbert Hoover, these makeshift communities reflected the economic realities of the time. Much of this period's hardship was seared deep into the American psyche. Images of the migrant mother and of the rural poor galvanized attention on the suffering of the destitute. John Steinbeck's novels detail the struggle of farmers escaping the Dust Bowl. Regions where land was affected by poor agricultural practices and were rendered not farmable by the later droughts. After Hoover's policies proved to be ineffective in alleviating much of the economic situation, people demanded change. A landslide presidential election victory propelled Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, into office, as he promised to enact drastic new measures, which he dubbed the New Deal in his election campaign. Large infrastructure projects were initiated. The unemployed were put into work by the government. Many of these measures were passed into law in the first 100 days of Roosevelt's presidency. As YouTuber and author John Green noted in his history series,
It Turns out that when it comes to getting our notoriously gridlocked Congress to pass legislation, nothing motivates like crisis and fear.
It was by capitalizing on this motivation, FDR was able to implement sweeping changes. When the stakes are higher and the needs are dire, things that were once deemed impossible suddenly became possible. This is evident again as governments around the world scramble to fast-track programs aimed at managing the COVID-19 crisis. Shortly before FDR's election win in 1932, he spoke about the need for action and experimentation. This country needs and demands bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something. It was with this mandate that legislations that changed American society were passed into law. The Wagner Act guaranteed workers' right to unionize. The Social Security Act provided a safety net funded through payroll taxes in the form of universal retirement pensions, unemployment insurance, welfare benefits to the disabled, and assistance to poor families. Some would say that this was one of the crowning achievements of FDR's presidency. Even though these measures didn't immediately end the recession, the eventual expenditures to fund the US war efforts did. They drastically recalibrated the government's relationship with the populace. Government expenditure as a percentage of the gross domestic product rose from Hoover's 3% to FDR's 20%. It became the norm for the government to intervene in people's welfare. The state became much more involved in the lives of Americans. As today's economic situation becomes dire, many governments around the world have started paying their citizens directly. This previously far-fetched idea has quickly become a reality. Only time will tell if this kind of intervening will continue to recalibrate the government's relationship with the people. Across the Atlantic Ocean from the United States, a different set of reactions to the Great Depression had been brewing in Germany. The 4 years before the downturn, from 1924 to 1928, had been dubbed by some historians as the Golden Age of the Weimar Republic. This was because during this period, Germany had seen a relative flourishing of economic and cultural life after the devastations of the First World War. By 1928, the country had mostly recovered from the social, financial, and political unrest in the years immediately following the end of the war. Beginning in 1929, however, the economic collapse in the United States impacted Germany initially in the form of US loan withdrawals. These massive loans were originally issued to stabilize the German economy after the war. The subsequent slowing of international trade compounded the adverse effects. To make matters worse, the government led by the Chancellor Heinrich Brüning decided to cut wages and raise taxes. The unemployment rate jumped from 1.25 million in 1928 to 6 million in 1932, roughly 30% of the working population. Whilst Americans replaced Hoover with Roosevelt, the Germans saw hope in both communists and NSDAP, aka the Nazi Party. The prevailing fear of communism and anarchism led to many businesses and industrialists favoring the parties staunchly against communism. The seats won by the Nazi Party in Germany went up from 12 in 1928 to 107 in 1930. By the election of July 1932, the Nazi Party had won 230 seats, not yet a majority, but by far the largest political party. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, there was a strong sentiment in the German public, especially those with ultra-nationalistic leanings, that the failure of the First World War was the result of politicians and certain groups backstabbing the German army. Conspiracy theories and fake news ran wild. They were fueled by people's biases and were used to further political agendas. In this case, anti-Semitism, populism, the fear of communism, and the failure of previous governments were the forces that propelled the Nazi Party into power. Hitler seized absolute power shortly after 1932. Within the first 100 days of becoming chancellor in 1933, Germany went from a democracy to a dictatorship. Civil liberties were curtailed, trade unions and other political parties were disbanded and banned, and opponents of Hitler were either arrested or assassinated. The rise of Hitler shows us that when people are biased, scared, and angry, they can be easily exploited. The defeat of World War I, combined with the economic impact of the Great Depression, readied the soil on which Hitler's ideas and rhetoric propagated and found momentum. Inherent flaws in democratic institutions allowed his movement to eventually gain absolute power. Hitler's rise shows that given the right environment and the emergence of a charismatic and eloquent ideologue, democracies could become autocracies very quickly. The fallout from the COVID-19 crisis may increase the possibility of such a development. Renowned historian and cognitive scientist and linguist Noam Chomsky warned of such a scenario in a 2010 interview with journalist Chris Hedges. The United States is extremely lucky that no honest, charismatic figure has arisen. Every charismatic figure is such an obvious crook that he destroys himself, like McCarthy or Nixon or the evangelist preachers. If someone comes along who is charismatic and honest, this country is in real trouble because of the frustration, disillusionment, and the justified anger and the absence of any coherent response. This could become an overwhelming force, and if it happens, it will be more dangerous than Germany. The United States is the world power. Germany was powerful, but had more powerful antagonists. I don't think all this is very far away. The phenomenon of Trump gave us a glimpse of that fragility. Trump is no Hitler, but the sentiments and mood displayed at his rallies are not a whole lot different from those observed in Italy and Germany in the 1920s and 30s. People are again angry and fearful. They resent the establishment. Conspiracy theories and fake news run wild. There's a general sense of betrayal. While as taxpayers felt the brunt of the impact of the 2008 financial crisis and footed the bill for its bailout, CEOs of banks and financial institutions profited from it. Despite the weakening of US global dominance and leadership since Trump's taking office, its military power is still unrivaled. US annual military spending is still greater than the next 7 countries combined. Meanwhile, the rise of authoritarianism and nationalism in China since Xi's taking office is especially alarming. Being the world's second highest military spender and a leading nuclear power, an ultra-nationalist China is not good for the world. The Doomsday Clock is a symbol for the likelihood of a human-created global catastrophe, or simply put, the destruction of the world. Since 1947, every year, members of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists get together and discuss threats the world faces and adjust the clock accordingly. In January 2020, the clock was moved forward to 100 seconds to midnight, closest it's ever been to doomsday. This is because of increased threats to global stability in the face of nuclear war and effects of climate change. No doubt that developments since January 2020 have increased the threats even further. The world is again at a crucial turning point, this time with even more at stake.